This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today goes right where I like to go. My style of thinking, whether it's the markets, life, you name it. Stefan Thomke from Harvard. His book, Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Whether you agree or disagree, or whether you know or don't know, that title tells you a lot. Experimentation absolutely works, but for many people, it's surprising. Look, the bottom line is, it's 2020. Are you flying blind? Have you tested something that you're working on? Do you know what people feel about your project, your experiment, your innovation? Have you got feedback? Do you know anything? Are you just guessing? Or are you just this intuitive grandmaster that knows all? Stefan has a background in the management of innovation. And look, if you get a chance to tell people about this particular topic and you are doing it at Harvard, that says a little bit about your authority, or at least worst case scenario, how much research you have put in. And I give Stefan credit. The research is there. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest today, Stefan Thomke, and talk about why experimentation works. So listen, here's where I want to jump in. I want to jump in with the idea of experimentation, but big picture philosophical. Give me the time in your life where you realized, okay, I can try a bunch of things. I don't really know what's going to happen, but the act of trying can give me an unexpected result that I couldn't perhaps predict from the outset. Even before we get into like the nitty-gritty of your world, when did that first happen in your life? Were you a kid?
Quite honestly, I got really interested in experimentation when I faced a very specific problem. It was in 1990, the summer of 1990. I had an internship, an engineering internship. It was basically sort of in a semiconductor facility, and I got an assignment. And the assignment was that I had to optimize, lots of technical lingo here, but I had to optimize the performance of photoresist. This is what you basically put on a wafer when you're making semiconductor chips. I had no idea how to begin. And then someone mentioned to me, there's this field of experimental design. You kind of just using a very systematic approach where you kind of try a bunch of different things. You change a bunch of different variables and so forth. And if you go through it very systematically, you will actually get an answer at the end. And I said, oh, wow, that's the answer to my problem. So I got a bunch of books and I started to read up on these things, even though, I had an engineering background, but nobody actually ever taught me this sort of thing. And I went through it and I spent the whole summer doing that. And then I realized that maybe I'm sort of discovering something big here, not just in engineering. Maybe there's a lot more to this beyond engineering. That's kind of how it all began. And then I obviously continued sort of to get into this and started to really study all the statistical underpinnings and so forth. There is actually a sort of science to this. I took all the courses and all that. Later on, when I finished my PhD and worked again, became handy again. Lo and behold, I was working as a consultant, and this became very, very sort of useful for me as well. Again, trying things in a systematic way, using sort of underlying statistics. And then later on, I pursued it in academia as well when I joined Harvard Business School in 1995.
Before I started doing this podcast, I had written some investment books. The investing strategy that I have written about is a very quantified, systematic approach. And essentially, it says, look, as an investor, we don't know what's going to happen over the course of the year. So let's have a diversified portfolio and let's follow from a momentum standpoint whichever market is breaking out up or down over the course of a year, and having an optimized strategy there to bet the right way on these markets when they unexpectedly start to move. When I got your book and I saw this Experimentation Works, it's the way a lot of great Wall Street traders think. They just can't really know what's going to happen. So they got to take a lot of bites at the apple. They end up with a lot of small losses. It's venture capital 101 as well.
That's great. And you point out something really important, Mike, here is it starts out with basically admitting that you don't know. I don't know what the future is going to look like. I don't know what's going to happen in a lot of the things that we do. There are two ways to find out. One way is trying to develop models or trying to predict the future, which is very difficult, and we've seen that usually it doesn't work out. Or why not just experiment? Why not just run the experiment and let the experiment tell us what's going to happen? But it's not so easy for some people to do it that way. And of course, there's got to be a systematic way behind sort of to do this. It's not just often when we talk about experiments in sort of the conventional English language, what we're saying is we're just trying things. It's more than just random trial and error where I just try things. There is actually a systematic way of doing it, and it's called the scientific method. And the scientific method is very, very powerful, and it can be applied to a lot more than just science.
Yeah, I'm curious. Here you are with around all these students at the Harvard Business School, and a lot of these students have been trained since a young age to follow the rules. Just follow the rules and you'll get the goal. Do you find that this notion of experimentation isn't a natural fit for all students? There's got to be some students that really, they've spent their whole life really not doing this.
It's not just not doing it. Sometimes what we're doing is we're making it actually worse by training them to be decisive leaders. When you kind of go up the hierarchy in a company, you have to be decisive. You have to be a decision maker. What I'm telling folks in this book is, wait a second, there are a lot of decisions maybe you shouldn't make because you just don't know what's going to happen. You're better off going into a meeting and telling people that you don't understand, you don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but let's run the experiment and let the experiment tell us or inform us in terms of what decision we should make. It is difficult. I have this story. One of the chapters is about a company called Booking.com. There's a story in there about a new CEO coming on board. They're having a discussion about the next corporate logo. The new CEO basically is in the meeting and says, okay, I've listened to all the opinions. Here's what we're going to do. And then someone looks at him and says, well, that's a really nice suggestion. We're going to run the test and let you know what happens. And that was a bit of a shocker, I think, to him when he was sitting there.
Now, it would not be a shocker to a Jeff Bezos.
No, not a Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos has been very consistent in terms of appreciating the value of experiments. In fact, if you go back and read the annual shareholder letter that he personally writes, and you go all the way back to the beginning, you'll find in a lot of these letters, he talks about experiments right from the beginning. Even today, even the last shareholder letter, he talks about it again. Jeff understands the value of experiments, both in the small and in the large. Experiments have different purposes. On one hand, you can use experiments to optimize things, such as the landing page of Amazon, where you go shopping, where everything that you see has been optimized. Every button, every color, every function, everything has been optimized using experiments, but also in the large to explore new terrains, strategic shifts and things like that. He understands, I think he never told me personally, but I think he understands it's just by reading what he says.
How did he find this style of managing, thinking, acting? Do you know the influences on him? When he first decided this is going to be the strategy, the approach that I'm going to take for this new startup in the mid-1990s?
Well, Mike, I can only infer from what he wrote because he obviously didn't personally tell me. But I can infer from it by reading about what he says. He spoke about this right from the beginning. I also do know from people who actually worked there that Amazon was one of the early users of experiments, along with Google and others. They built an internal organization that focused on running experiments very early on before anybody else was using it, which was used to optimize, again, the shopping experience. So not just by his words, but also by the actions that we're taking within Amazon, it's quite clear that he understood the value of this approach right from the beginning.
If I am to think about his competition, I don't mean his competition at Amazon. I'm not so sure they have competitors these days, but just in general, the Fortune top 1,000, whatnot, how many firms do you think really have in their DNA this experimentation mindset?
Not enough, but an increasing number. I mean, that's part of the reason why I wrote this book, Experimentation Works, is I want to get the message out. But there's an increasing number of companies, even Fortune 500, that are now using experimentation tools. I think the real question is the scale, Mike. It's one thing to really dabble with experimentation in a corner in the organization. It's another thing to really fully embrace it and run it at massive scale. And when I talk about scale, I'm talking about thousands or 10,000s of experiments, live experiments on you and me every single year. I think that is the challenge, really. But you will see that there are hundreds, even thousands of companies now that are using these tools in one way or another, and starting to experiment. Not, by the way, not just online, but also in a brick and mortar setting as well. So it's not just an online phenomena. The challenge is really sort of to move up, what I call the experimentation organization, where experimentation becomes a little bit like running the numbers, since you were talking about finance earlier, or like breathing, where it becomes something that's totally natural and it's something that you do a lot, and where all the decisions that can be tested are actually sort of adjudicated by experiments. So that's another level. And when you're sort of looking at that level where experimentation is a huge deal, where you become an experimentation organization, then there are not so many companies around, but there should be, because this is going to be the name of the game. This is going to be the way companies will compete going forward.
And it's really going to be a ground up coding operation. I mean, you've got to build something from the ground up. We're sitting here talking about testing, to test on the scale that we're talking about Amazon. I can't even imagine the man hours that have gone into not only the philosophical underpinning of what is it that we're actually going to code, then the man hours to code it. I mean, they've got something that is terribly unique, and they're not alone. I mean, you mentioned Google. That ground up coding and the testing ability on scale, just an insane amount of work.
Yes, to build the infrastructure is a lot of work, Mike. And in fact, a lot of the companies that are doing this at scale, whether it's an Amazon or Google or Microsoft or Netflix or a Booking.com, they started out building their own tools, building their own infrastructure, because when they decided to do this, there was nothing around really. There were no third-party tools around. Now you can actually go out and you can buy third-party tools. So that helps. So you don't have to go in and make this massive investment. Just to give you kind of a sense, at Microsoft, there are something like around 90 people or so that are just working on building and improving the infrastructure. It's close to 100 sort of people effort, or it's been there, close to 100 people effort just to kind of get this up to scale. Other companies don't have that many people, and they're still managed to get considerable scale going. But Mike, to me, the real challenge is not just building the infrastructure and the tools. The real challenge to me is to build a culture of experimentation. I think the cultural challenges are even more than sort of the infrastructure challenges, because it requires you sort of a fundamental sort of rethinking of how you do things, how you make decisions. There are a number of elements that you need to overcome, a number of things that you need to overcome sort of culturally in order for this to work. It's going to take some time to get there.
It's interesting you mentioned the overcoming cultural issues. I mean, Francis Bacon, as you write about, this is put in motion, the scientific method 400 years ago. So it's kind of interesting that we had these great thinkers long times ago. Then perhaps we've, up until maybe the last 15 or 20 years, people had not gone that direction. It was very much the John Wayne CEO in some ways. I'm the boss. Here's the decision. Here's the way we're going.
That's sometimes the way we teach them, unfortunately. But I think things are going to be different going forward. And thank you for invoking Francis Bacon. So it's exactly 400 years. He wrote his book, his famous book, Novum Organum, in 1620. What he was trying to do at the time is he was trying to develop a new instrument for building and organizing knowledge, and that is scientific knowledge. And I think we're now have an opportunity to do the same for perhaps management knowledge and behavioral knowledge, sort of what people actually do. When you actually read the book, and it's not an easy read, by the way, Mike, sort of Nova Mark because the way they wrote back then was a little different than they're writing today. But one of sort of the big ahas I think that he had is that people and our senses are not really that great at actually discerning what works and what doesn't work because we often get fooled by our senses. We have a lot of cognitive blind spots, and therefore he was advocating an empirical approach to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and that is to essentially run the experiment. That became the integral part of sort of this scientific method, which of course changed our lives. And now we sort of go forward in time, and even though technology and science and everything has changed, but people are still people. We still, 400 years later, face exactly the same challenges that he wrote about back in 1620. That's a challenge. When we sort of think about cultural challenges, there's a number of things that we need to overcome.
Let's talk about something that it's right in the same headspace where we are at right now with experimentation. But the notion of brainstorming, this is something that I just love to bounce ideas with people, to just get into the room and just throw things back and forth, because from a collaboration standpoint, you just don't know what's going to happen when you get bright minds in a room and you start bouncing things. And then the next thing you know, someone's finishing your sentence with a derivative of where you were thinking, and it's 10 times better than what you were thinking. However, in my experience, that's not a natural way. And you just mentioned some of the cultural issues and perhaps behavioral issues, various biases that we all have. But one of the reasons I love seeing a title like this is I hope this kind of thinking happens, because I just think too many people don't have a chance to experience what it feels like that when you are experimenting, when you are collaborating, when you are brainstorming, and something magical happens. It's just amazing, because then you realize the whole way that we are often taught and the whole way we often go through life, marching forward, following the rules. And then there's this whole different way of thinking over here that not as many people are paying attention to, that you're right in the middle of.
Yes, I agree. Brainstorming is absolutely fantastic, and it's also absolutely necessary for a number of reasons, Mike. Well, first of all, turns out that when you look at that data here, which I've done in online experiments, turns out that we are wrong most of the time. That is, when we sort of make assumptions about things that we think are going to happen, there's a consistent number. They're finding that Google or Booking.com and all these organizations run experiments. Turns out that they're wrong about 9 out of 10 times.
Hold on, when you say they're wrong, we're talking, this could be the color, the landing page, the headline, the button, you name it.
Everything. This is kind of an average when they're running online experiments. And these are experts, by the way, Mike. These are not novices. Even the experts are wrong most of the time. And what I mean by wrong means they launch an experiment on their landing page and they make a prediction or they have a hypothesis of what's likely to happen. Turns out that either they get a null result, that means there's no effect, or they get a result that goes in the opposite direction of what they expected. That's what happens the majority of the times. It basically tells us that if we don't do brainstorming and all these kinds of things, if we just charge ahead, turns out that we're wrong most of the times. One of the values of brainstorming is to challenge our assumptions, to think outside the box and not to take everything sort of for granted. Now, there's another reason why brainstorming and other what I call qualitative methods, such as focus groups, qualitative research, and all these kinds of things, are really important, even in the world of experimentation. Because, and in fact, it turns out, Mike, that all these companies that I write about, they all do these kinds of things. They do all the qualitative research that all companies do. They go, even Booking.com, they go to bars and show people their landing pages. I mean, they do all this stuff. They have psychologists. But all these things are used to generate hypotheses, Because when you're running a lot of experiments, you need a lot of hypotheses, and hypotheses still come from people. So what's the difference then if all companies do this? Well, many organizations do all this, and then they go directly from that research to decision. What these companies do is they have an intermediate step. The intermediate step is the experiment. The experiment kind of to tell them what works and doesn't work before they launch or before they make that big decision. And I think that's the big difference. The world of experimentation is not so different. All the stuff around big data analytics, all the stuff around focus, all the sort of conventional things you can still use, but you use it as a way to generate hypotheses, not a way to go directly to launching things.
Let me get political on you for a second. Not political to pick a side or anything like that, but there is an experimentation process going on right now, which is terribly unique, at least from my perspective. So until today, I have not seen a Bloomberg ad. Okay. So I know, because everyone's talking about them, that there's lots of Bloomberg ads running. I did see tonight on CNN, he spent $400 million on ads. Bernie Sanders has spent $40 million, so 10 times more. So I went and I looked at a couple of these ads and I thought to myself, oh my gosh. Now, if you were trying to start a business, you might not spend $400 million to start a business. However, with the way that he is running these ads on the radio, on the TVs, local stations, covering the country, then having these direct response numbers that you can dial on your phone, I just can't imagine the interesting political information. And look, I'm not saying yes or no to Mr. Bloomberg. I'm just talking about the interesting process that his team is doing. Oh my gosh, they've got to be assembling the most interesting political database ever.
I've seen some ads, Mike, which is interesting, and I sit in Massachusetts. He's clearly after, which is very democratic, he's clearly going after all kinds of voters. I can only imagine, I don't know for a fact, I can only imagine that he's got a fairly sophisticated operation running, which this sort of thing experiments. I know that because the Obama campaign back then had a fairly sophisticated operation where they were doing a lot of experiments with ads and all sorts of things.
But it's got to be tiny compared to this money he's spending. If he's doing what you're talking about in terms of running multiple variations of ads and having different response numbers that people can text to get more information, oh my God, it's just got to be fascinating how much they're learning that perhaps no one else has ever really learned about the American population.
I hope, Mike, that without getting political, I hope that all campaigns are doing this, because if they don't, I can tell you they are at a significant disadvantage, because this is very powerful. I mean, you can test things. When you're running so many ads, you can try different ads. You can see how people respond to it. You can refine those ads. I mean, you can run an amazing operation sort of in the background that basically will help you to be way more effective at reaching voters. Voters is all about sort of behavior.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I bring up politics, we could be talking widgets. It was just an interesting example where you can just see the scale behind it, and the process that he's running is right in your headspace.
And it's not so different, Mike, than running a business, quite honestly, because at the end of the day, of course, when I'm running online, when I'm running a landing page, if I'm Amazon or Booking.com or any of these companies, I'm aiming mostly for conversion. That is, someone who goes on the landing page needs to be converted. That means they need to book something or buy something. Well, in a political campaign, it's not so different, because I want to convert people. I want them to engage with basically my campaign. And again, anybody who's not doing this at scale, and I know about some of sort of the operations and sort of that are running in the background. I don't know about Bloomberg, but I know about some others. Anybody not doing this at full scale and is investing heavily in this is going to be at a major disadvantage. I think that's for sure. I think it's a real test for the people who are running political campaigns, because I sense, and I'm watching the news probably just like you do, there are a lot of people in there that are driven by strong opinions, by intuition, by all these things. And it would be easy for them to kind of just dismiss this because they've been there, they've done that. They feel that they sort of know what works. I think even when you look at it, even someone like Trump, for example, who comes across as very intuitive, driven by gut, I can assure you, and it's public knowledge, that the operation that's behind it is not a gut-driven operation. In fact, it's a fairly sophisticated analytics operation. I mean, that's the age that we're in. I think all political campaigns have to understand the value of sort of running these experiments at scale in order to win, because that's what it's all about at the end.
Let me take it off the word scale for a second and scale back. Let me scale back to just the guy in the garage. I watched a Steve Wozniak documentary the other day. There's the great Apple story, the garage and all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about cheap experiments, because here we are making a case. We're talking about very large operations and big amounts of money. But look, this process that you're talking about is a philosophy at the start. If you employ that philosophy in whatever you're doing in life, it doesn't mean these experiments have to be expensive. I mean, cheap experiments can give you a lot of data, a lot of good data, which can then help on the decision process.
In fact, experiments have become very cheap, Mike. At one level, it's an approach, it's a mindset, as you said. It's the notion of sort of trying to understand sort of that experimentation is sort of the way to approach this, to sort of understand what works and what doesn't work. Once you buy into this mindset, it can be very powerful because you will in fact sort of go for the test. At the same time, experiments have also become very cheap. Yes, you don't have to do it at scale. In fact, there are some low-cost tools available that you can get, that you can sort of run with. But even the notion of prototyping, testing ideas, that's pretty much anybody can do that. It's a very powerful sort of way of resolving things. It's not surprising that, in fact, a lot of startups have adopted this approach as well. They may not have large traffic yet. They may not have a lot of customers yet to test things on. But it's still sort of a better way than investing a lot in market research and all the kinds of things that we sort of traditionally sort of do, because it is, in fact, very cheap to do so. It's very, very powerful.
I brought up Apple, and Apple's such an interesting example because I think at first blush, if we look at the last, I guess since the mid 1990s, I guess 25 years of their second kind of rebirth, is that it kind of looked like that Steve Jobs would anoint a product, go on stage, sell it, and generally the things that he promoted for the last, before he passed, just did exceptionally well and became one of the most powerful companies on the planet. I've had a chance to talk to programmers on this podcast, one guy who is in charge of the digital keyboard on the phones, and he was talking about the process of going in front of Jobs. It sounded very much like one guy's aesthetic appeal, who had a very good aesthetic appeal and kind of really, he had that down. I might argue, and I'm curious your view on this, okay, maybe Steve made pretty good decisions for that long stretch, but they'd launch products and they would learn and they would do new products and they would adjust. I mean, each product they were launching was an experiment. There's been how many different iPhones now? They keep learning and they keep growing and they keep getting feedback. I think it's still in the same headspace, but it is interesting that perhaps there will be some business leaders that kind of still have some of that John Wayne intuitive ability, but obviously Apple is experimenting all the time as well.
Well, I think Steve Jobs was an exceptional person. Every CEO wants to be like Steve Jobs until they're not. He was maybe an exception, but I want to kind of dispel a myth. People think that Apple has always been this super intuitive company where everything was done by gut and all that, but that's actually not true. I mean, even Apple is an experimenter, maybe experimentation in the small rather than the big. But even a company like that cannot go without experimenting, without iterating, and they're doing it, in fact, a lot.
Oh, I mean, yeah, every piece of their user interface, every piece of their hardware has been an experiment.
Everything is tested. They're testing a lot as well. So I think testing is sort of part of it. And Richard Feynman was one of my favorite scientists. He's a great physicist, Nobel Prize teacher, storyteller. He once said, which was really great, he said, it doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make any difference how smart you are. Who made that guess or what his name is? If it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. He made that point about science, but I think the same can be said about all kinds of decisions. It's ultimately the experiment that tells you whether you're wrong or right. It doesn't matter sort of where you are in the hierarchy, whether you're at a low level or at a high level, Because just like in nature, you will find out at some point if you're wrong. Except it make it really, really expensive by the time you find out. There's this great story that I have in the book since you started with Apple. There's another Apple executive, Ron Johnson, who built together with Jobs the Apple Store's most successful retail concept, perhaps in the last 2 decades. Amazing success story. Ron Johnson gets hired by JCPenney, big box retail stores across the US. JCPenney, of course, tells Ron Johnson, we'll make you CEO, we'll give you a huge bonus if you succeed. By the way, we want you to do for JCPenney what you did for Apple. He comes in and, of course, he immediately rolls out all the kinds of things that worked so well for the Apple stores, for example, getting rid of discounts and so on. 18 months later, JCPenney was fighting for its survival. Ron Johnson was let go. The old CEO came back in, and he just wanted to get back to normal. What's the difference? Well, they didn't run a test. There was no experiment.
I think JCPenney sells cheap underwear and cheap socks. I don't know what the comparison would have been there.
People go there because they get coupons, because they want to get deals. Mike, it's a completely different sort of customer base, but I think he must have felt that he can move sort of the customers into a new experience, and the customers didn't respond. He called it, even though I think he wouldn't think of himself as an arrogant person, he called it situational arrogance. And I think we're all vulnerable to suffering from situational arrogance, that we may be modest people, but there are situations where we think, where we know it all, we can get into trouble. Mark Twain once said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. That's what gets you into trouble. It's just when you're sort of really certain about what's going to happen, you should be very, very cautious. That's really the issue.
You've got this phrase that I've seen in your work, and I've seen it a couple different ways, from high velocity learning to high velocity incrementalism. There's something about the phrase high velocity. I don't know. First off, I love saying it. Number two, though, you just know this is the path where we all need to be, because it's kind of like ready, set, aim, shoot, ready, set, aim, shoot. I mean, you can't sit still. You got to keep going.
Yes, you got to keep going, Mike. The trick is when you're running experiments, you got to move fast. Of course, there are some limits in terms of how fast you can move, and they're usually dictated by the underlying sort of statistical science. But you got to keep things moving. And it's something that even a guy like Thomas Edison sort of understood a long time ago, that he always said the real measure of success is the number of experiments that can be crowded into 24 hours. And that's what we wanted to do. We want to do this at high velocity, because when you do high velocity, you get quick feedback. There's another thing that's also really important. That is, when someone comes up with a hypothesis or has an idea or something like that, the half-life of these things is very short. That is, imagine, Mike, you come up with a hypothesis, and now you have to sit there and you have to wait a month or 2 months until someone runs a test and gives you feedback on your hypothesis. Probably by the time they run the test, you don't care anymore. You've moved on. You're doing other things. It's really important to do this at high velocity. You also need to do high velocity if you want to increase scale, if you want to do sort of more of it. The ideal scenario, and this is, by the way, this is exactly what happens in a company like Booking.com or even a smaller startup, a garage, is you want to come in the morning, you want to look at sort of the data, or you want to have some hypothesis, you want to write up the experiments, you want to launch it by lunchtime, then you want to let it run, then kind of get feedback as soon as possible. Typically, by the way, in the online sort of area, companies have to run these experiments for about 2 weeks to have enough statistical integrity in the results. But you want to basically let it run and then get feedback. And then based on the feedback, you do another one, and another one, another one. And you do that sort of at scale. High velocity is really the name of the game here. It also, when you do it high velocity, it also establishes a rhythm, a pace in terms of how you work. I think having a rhythm or a pace for experiments is really important as well. That is, if you're constantly running experiments, if you have a hypothesis or an idea or something like that to be tested, if I can't do it today, but I can get on the train tomorrow or on the day afterwards. Again, running this fast is really important. And it's also when you have a relatively low hit rates, let's say you have a hit rate of 10%, that is 90% doesn't work. It helps to run 1,000 experiments then over a year, live experiments, because even with 1,000 experiments, your hit rate is still 100 successes. That could really move the needle for a lot of companies.
In this trading world, it's kind of like, okay, if you got take 100 trades and you only got 35 winners, but if the winners are 4 times bigger than your losers and you got a positive mathematical edge and you bet properly, you got a good game there. And it's all about knowing from the beginning that you're going to have more losses than wins. But it's the size of the wins is what matters.
Exactly. And there is a long tail.
There you go.
So the winners can be really, really big. I mean, there's an example from Microsoft where they did a little experiment. An employee couldn't get sort of the attention from his boss, had sort of an idea about sort of how headlines are displayed. And the thing was basically sitting there for 6 months because nobody was paying attention. And he finally decided to launch it himself without getting permission from anybody. Well, to make a long story short, that thing moved the needle by $100 million of additional revenue that one year when they launched it, and the same amount every year going forward. It seemed like a little small thing that didn't really feel like it's going to make much of a difference. Well, it did. In the digital world, sort of the economics are a little different. I've been studying innovation for more than 25 years now, and one of the classical assumptions that we make in innovation is that small innovations are associated with small changes in performance, and big innovations, breakthrough innovations, are associated with big changes in performance or outcomes. Well, in the digital world, it's not that way. You can have a little thing, can have a 3 or 4 or 5% change, an improvement. But if you start multiplying that times 100 million and you can scale it instantly, you can move the needle in a big way.
Yeah. Is there any pushback? I mean, I go through your work, I have this conversation with you. All I'm thinking is, well, gosh, I wish in my life I need to apply more and more and more of this thinking and these operations and these processes to my world. Do people legitimately sit down and give you criticism or critique about this style of thinking, this style of executing business strategy, where you go, oh, yeah, you've got a point? Or, I mean, is there any pushback?
In general, when I speak about experimentation, you don't get much pushback. People think, yes, experimentation makes sense. It's fine. But when you get to the specifics, sometimes there's pushback. I'll give you an example. So I was talking about this experimentation testing driven approach to making decisions. I gave a big lecture, and actually the room was full of entrepreneurs, CEOs, and suddenly one participant, his hand shoots up and he seemed almost upset. And he told me, he said, listen, what you're sort of advocating here is will kill basically everything that I emphasize in my company. I tell people that intuition, judgment, and all these things is really important, creativity. But what you're sort of advocating, it will kill creativity, will kill intuition, everything has to be a test. I don't want to do that. And I think he mistakenly assumed that it's one or the other. I told him then that the two things complement each other. They're not competing against each other. In fact, as I mentioned before, Mike, is that you still need, even in an experimentation-driven approach, you need people to come up with hypotheses. The experiment is just an experiment. It's garbage in, garbage out. You can run an awful experiment, but you need people to come up with sort of interesting hypotheses that really challenge you. And where do these hypotheses come from? Well, they come from things like observations, surprises, intuition, lots of different sort of paths. So the two things complement each other. They're not a substitute to each other. Another criticism that I sort of have come across, Mike, is that we now live in a world of big data. Big data and business analytics, we just look at all the data. We don't really have to understand causality anymore. Causality means that if I do A, B happens. We just do a lot of data mining. Why waste time on this? Of course, what people don't understand often is when you're just relying on a lot of the data around you, when you're running regressions and all these things, you learn about correlations. That is, two things just vary together, but you don't learn about causality. You need experiments to tell you about causality, and there are a lot of nonsense correlations that are around. You may be aware, for example, of the fact that there's a strong correlation between the size of your palm and your life expectancy. That is, your smaller your palm, the longer you live. There's a very strong correlation.
I'm looking at my palm, but I can't compare it to anybody else's right now because I'm only looking at my palm.
Yes, exactly. You could be either happy or this is the first thing that happens. But of course, Mike, the underlying variable is gender. Women in general have smaller palms and they live longer. There are a lot of things like that around where we just find correlation between things. But what we need causation. Mike, when you decide to give a sales incentive to your salespeople, you want to know about causality because you want to know that if I give them a sales incentive, revenue will go up, or sort of what they will do is they will generate more revenue for the company. When we're managers, when we take actions, we want to know about causality. Correlations are not good enough for us. To do that, we need to complement all this big data stuff and all this sort of things. We need to complement it with the experiment because a well-designed experiment, well-run experiment, can in fact tell us something about causality, whether A causes B. So there's a number of different things. I don't sort of call them pushbacks. I think they're kind of myths. People kind of believe these things. And then what happens is that because they believe in these kinds of myths, then they're reluctant to take action.
If we keep running those experiments, though, we don't necessarily have, we can't really predict the outcomes. And if that's going to be the process going forward, running experiments can't predict the outcomes, it becomes tough to know what's causal. It becomes tough to know why did something become the winner chicken dinner optimization that we tried, the experiment that we run, and that one worked. And if that becomes our ongoing thing, it's tricky, isn't it?
Well, running the experiment is really the only way sort of to find out whether something causes something else. Because a lot of, how do you know what you know, Mike, right? Well, what we know often is what we either learned in school or through observation. We're kind of observing things around us. Then we may have a few data points. And then based on that, we think we know what causes what. But of course, that's very misleading because there's no control. There's nothing in there. And again, like the example I just gave you, someone could be looking at the size of a hand and at some point measure life expectancy and then conclude from that there's sort of a relationship. The only thing that will really tell us what runs is sort of this controlled experiment, sort of rigorous experiment. And by the way, not every decision that we make has to be exactly in line with the experiment. Sometimes the experiment may tell us something that we don't want to do or that we cannot do because of contract. There's a great example that the Wall Street Journal wrote about with Netflix, for example. I don't know if you've ever seen sort of the show Grace and Frankie. Netflix basically had sort of a promotion for the show. And what they did, Netflix is also an avid experimenter.
I can see them experimenting on me every time I turn it on.
They certainly do. They certainly do. What they do, Mike, is they run, for example, these promotions. And what they will do is they will run different kinds of promotions and test them on various people. They ran this one promotion to actors in there, Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda, but they sort of ran sort of the promotion, one sort of ad had just Lily Tomlin in there without Jane Fonda. And it turned out that when they actually measured the clicks, they found it's actually better to run sort of the ad with just one of the actresses, and that is Lily Tomlin, but not Jane Fonda. Now, what do? You're sitting there now, and you're getting these results back, and does that mean we should take her out of sort of the ads? I mean, she's a star actor. Of course, they decided that this would alienate sort of the actress and possibly violate sort of her contract. So they ended up putting her in anyway. But the experiment or the test actually kept you honest. It told you had to be honest about why you're actually putting her in. You couldn't say we're putting her in because our viewers like it. No, we had to put her in because of other considerations. And even when you don't follow the test or the experiment is a way of keeping you honest.
That example with Tomlin and Fonda, perhaps they couldn't act on it at that moment in time, but for something in the future, they very well, for sure, saved that information and will consider it perhaps in the future.
And possibly for other actors, maybe someone who doesn't have that kind of star power, they may just go ahead. And if the two names had been different, they probably would have taken a different course of action. So again, even in situations where the experiment tells you to go left, you end up going right, at least you know why you're going right and you can't fool yourself.
You brought him up earlier, and I'm curious because I really enjoy finding I've probably already done and found all of his YouTube videos. That's Richard Feynman. He's got this one, I think, on coding. He's at the blackboard, looks a little younger. Just, gosh, he's such a clear thinker. I mean, you really can't help but improve yourself to listen to Feynman talk about anything.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And I've watched lots of things. And even when I was a student with the Feynman diagrams in physics, you have to ask yourself, Mike, someone of his brilliance, I mean, he was clearly one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. Someone as brilliant as him, someone who knows as much as him, even for someone like him to admit that it's the experiment that shows you whether you're wrong or not. I mean, that takes something. If Richard Feynman can admit it, we should all be able to admit it.
I was going to say, what's so great about that point, though, too, for anyone listening, if Feynman can say that, and you really believe, if we really truly understand at what level he was coming at the intellect from, then it's an easy way to go through the rest of our lives, because it's kind of like, well, he becomes the model. It's like, okay, if he can say that, if he can do that, and I'm not just below him, then why can't I just accept that on its face and go with the Feynman mentality right out of the gate?
That's a great point, Mike, and I absolutely agree. He's way above us all in terms of pure intellect. He even understood sort of the power of sort of the humble experiment in science in general, even in science, which is interesting. And he was in the physical sciences. In the physical sciences, we understand a lot more than in the behavioral sciences. Even in the physical sciences, someone as brilliant as him, for him to make that admission, that means that us as lower sort of human beings in the behavioral sciences should at least sort of be able to measure up to the same thing.
I've not taken you down a kind of walk through the book today. It's dense. It's the optimization of the whole understanding of the process. You break it down to all of the levels that we should be thinking about if we're going to go down this path of experimentation, which we obviously all should be. The book, Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Is there anything I missed today? Is there anything really important that you wanted to discuss or bring up that I should have asked you about?
The experimental approach or experimentation should be sort of part of what every company does. It's that mindset, whether it's a small company or a big company, whether it's online, whether it's brick and mortar, whether it's B2B or B2C, it's a mindset. But I wanted the book to be much more about than just a mindset. As you said, I wanted it to be about the nitty-gritty, because there is a lot of nitty-gritty to do this right. So it's not the kind of book that you read from a flight from New York to Boston or even from New York to LA. It's a book that you go back to, over and over again, and actually getting guidance on some of these things. For example, what is a good experiment? Well, we know what a good experiment is. Basically, sort of lay it all out sort of for the reader in terms of here are all the details. This is the gold standard. You don't have to measure up to the gold standard every single time, but at least you know what it is.
Easily found at all of your favorite online bookstores, including Mr. Bezos, and you are easily found at Harvard. Is there any other website that you would like people to check you out at?
No, usually go to my website. I have a forward. You type in www.thomke.com. Will take you to my HBS sort of landing page. Send me a note when you sort of reach out to me that you listened to this podcast, so I know what the connection is. I'm out there. I respond to emails. I respond to messages. I want to engage with the world sort of in a conversation around experimentation. That's what it's all about.
It really is. I appreciate you taking the time and effort to put it together. It's one of those great educational reminders, lessons, the direction that we all need to be going in. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.